Hi, I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream. Today, in some countries, people living with HIV can be criminally charged for unintentionally transmitting or exposing others to the virus. We speak with advocates calling on governments to rethink what they say are fear-based and outdated laws. My co-host and our digital producer, Omar Badar, is here, and he's looking out for your live feedback. What are you seeing?
You know, we're seeing a lot of people actually weighing in, and some are making some interesting comparisons, like Hadim over here, who says HIV criminalization has huge reach and is like criminalizing drug addicts to the umpteenth. Hosting a disease should never be a crime. And we have Esther over here, who says those laws are ridiculous and kind of discriminatory. Now, for those of you at home, I know many of you are wondering what HIV criminalization is exactly, and we're going to be getting into that. In the meantime, you can join this conversation by tweeting us using the hashtag you see at the bottom of the screen, AJStream.
Hello, my name is Sean Decker. I'm an HIV-positive writer and musician, and I pitched today's show on HIV criminalization because I feel like these laws are antiquated. I feel like they don't even consider the science and how HIV is actually transmitted, and they prohibit people who are wondering what their status is from getting tested for HIV. So that's one of the reasons why I think this is such an important topic, and I am in the stream.
As you just saw from Sean Decker there, these laws came in response to the HIV/AIDS crisis of the 1980s, a time when there was limited information about the virus and a diagnosis was considered a death sentence. But even with more research 3 decades later, countries are still enforcing criminal statutes that authorities say will help curtail the spread of the virus. Well, today, activists are fighting to change laws that they say make being HIV positive a crime. So to help explain the reality and the misconceptions, we're joined by Ken Penkela. He's an HIV advocate who was convicted in 2012 of assault and battery for HIV exposure. He'll tell his story shortly. Edwin Bernard is the global coordinator at the HIV Justice Network in the UK. In Namibia, we have Michaela Clayton. She is the director of the AIDS and Rights Alliance for Southern Africa. And in New Delhi, Anand Grover. He's a senior advocate at the Supreme Court of India and former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health. Welcome everyone to the stream. Now, Ken, I want to start with you. You were a lieutenant colonel at the Pentagon when you were sentenced to a military prison for exposure. What does that mean?
It's so funny when people ask that. We still have that question. What does exposure mean? Technically, they say that you somehow exposed the virus via some bodily fluid, because it's the only way, of course, the virus can be transmitted, to another person unknowingly. In some instances, obviously, infection doesn't have to take place. Non-disclosure is usually the basis that you didn't tell the person. And in most cases, nothing has to happen. Literally, the person's status, like my status, was used against me without any of those other criteria.
So what's the evidence in this case then? How is this proved?
So mine is very different, and my case does expand this whole discussion from the U.S. state laws, and then you'll hear about the other laws that Edwin and his group and the other two panels will talk about. It's pandemic across the globe, this misunderstanding of the current science and medicine surrounding HIV, and how is it transmitted? There's still the fear that in your lead-in, you talked about HIV had this terrible fear that it was a death sentence. And today, this is great timing for you guys to host us. Today's National HIV Testing Day here in the United States. And we have, because of the laws, there's been this terrible misnomer. It's take the test and risk arrest. Because you can literally, without sexual contact, without any kind of exposure to another person's blood, regardless if we're on medication and I'm undetectable and healthy, I can't transmit the virus, it's used against you, and you literally are HIV exposure. It's a very loose definition.
Yep. To talk a little bit about these laws, this is something we're hearing about from our online community as well. People like Mikey here, who says HIV laws made sense 30 years ago. It was scary times and not much was known. Now they stigmatize and penalize being sick isn't a crime. And Wanda says HIV criminalization is a long conversation, but all kinds of laws need to modernize and be based on real science. Edwin, I'm going to throw this to you. Can you tell us a little bit about how current laws are basically not on with current science?
Yeah, well, the problem is that although quite a lot of the laws, as you've said, were passed from 30 years ago, And there are now 72 countries around the world that actually have HIV-specific criminal laws around non-disclosure, potential or perceived exposure, or non-intentional transmission. Prosecutions are actually ramping up and have ramped up in the last 10 years. And new laws continue to be passed. So in the last few years, we've actually had 4 countries in Africa have passed new laws. In fact, back in 2000, there were no countries in Africa at all that had HIV criminalization laws, and now 30 of them do. And quite a lot. One of the problems is that some of these laws were actually instigated by USAID when they wanted to pass a model law to actually protect people with HIV, but they added in this rather vague statute. And even in the countries that haven't used this model law, they've been looking at the US and at Canada and at certain countries in Europe, like Sweden, like the Nordic countries, and Switzerland and Austria, which are the countries that have been prosecuting the most people, and think it's a good idea, when in fact all of the evidence is pointing to that these laws are not only outdated and based on stigma, not science, but they actually do more harm than good in terms of the overall HIV response, as Ken mentioned.
So Edwin, I want to pause you just there, because you've mentioned so many things, and I just want to make sure that our audience gets all of them. And one in particular that I'm going to pull out here is that you said these laws were originally meant to protect. I want to pass it over to Anand, because if that was the original intent behind these laws, do you believe that that's now how they're being implemented? And can you tell us more about why they needed to be in place in the first place?
Well, they need not have been there in the first place at all. It was a reaction to, as a prejudicial reaction to the situation at the time. People believe that if you criminalize, then you can stop people from transmitting disease. And as Edwin and Ken have mentioned earlier, the law doesn't require that you transmit. You can unknowingly have contact and do nothing, and still you are penalized. It was based on actually prejudice and stigma, which was not really warranted at all, and more so now. But unfortunately, it is actually that, as Edwin mentioned, the Nordic countries, the US, which should have better science dictating their laws, they have actually continued their laws, and they are actually exposing more and more people to criminal prosecutions, and particularly vulnerable groups, and in countries like India, women, but also gay men, transgender people, because it's easy to pick on them. So it's very unfortunate, and as again Edwin mentioned, it actually drives people underground because they don't want to be tested, because they fear risk of prosecution, and it's not based on science. Science cannot tell you who transmitted it to whom unless you do very sophisticated tests. And in most countries where you don't have proper diagnostic techniques, it's the poor, the vulnerable, the women, transgender people who are actually victimized, though they may not even have transmitted the disease. Yep. These laws are not required, they have to be changed.
Yep. And you mentioned that there are a lot of people who, basically that it drives testing underground. We have a couple of comments that go along similar lines. We have DTV over here who says that these laws increase the infection rate as people are afraid to get tested. And then we also have a video comment from Nina. Take a listen to what she has to say.
My name is Nina Martinez, and I'm standing outside the National Center for Civil and Human Rights here in Atlanta, Georgia. Today in the United States is National HIV Testing Day, so there will be a lot of emphasis on increasing the number of new diagnoses among people who are HIV positive but don't know it. However, we have a criminalization law in Georgia, and we can't say know your status and in the same breath take the test and risk arrest. There will not be any noticeable gains in HIV prevention if we don't reform these laws.
So, Michaela, I'm struggling with this a little bit. I'm hoping that you can explain it to me. I mean, I get that there are a lot of laws that are a bit outdated, but at the same time, just the importance of getting tested seems to be so much the obvious choice that it's hard for me to imagine that a reasonable person would take the risk of not wanting to know because of having to deal with these kinds of things. Can you explain to me why it actually does drive these things underground?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I just want to take one step backwards before that and pick up on the what Anand was saying about, the reason for these laws being seen as needed to protect people against HIV. And in the region that I work in, Southern and East Africa, it's interesting that the original calls for the passing of these kind of laws came largely from women's groups. women who were understandably frustrated and scared about the fact that they were being infected within their relationships because they were unable to insist on safer sex. It's ironic because actually the impact of these laws is particularly burdensome on women. Women are very often the first to know their status because they attend antenatal clinics. They find out they're HIV positive. They are in a relationship where the power imbalance is very great. It's very often difficult for women to disclose their HIV status to their partner for a very real fear of violence or being, kicked out of the home. Often a home in which the woman is economically dependent on the man. So it's difficult to disclose their status because of this fear. It's difficult to insist on safer sex because of the power imbalance within relationships. But then at the end of the day, if the man becomes infected or learns that he's HIV positive, it's the woman who gets prosecuted at the end of the day. So why would a woman want to know her HIV status if she is going to risk being prosecuted for transmission of HIV or even exposure to HIV in terms of a lot of the laws in this region? So it has the effect of driving not only women, but people generally away from testing services, because if you don't know your status, you can't be prosecuted.
And Michaela, as you were saying that, I could see Ken here nodding his head. How did this affect your own life personally?
Sure. So I'm going to take all three other panelists in their comments. That my case personally, no means likely to transmit the virus. The only common piece that I have in this is my status, and my status is used against me. As I've had some other solicitors, other attorneys here, as the common term, look at my case, they've literally come back and said, if you were negative, there was nothing there. So when you break these down, you don't have to transmit. Make sure we're going to really beat that out to your listeners and to the viewers. You don't have to transmit. You don't even have to have a means likely for transmission, sexual contact, accidental or intentional. The fact is that the stigmatization and the fear surrounding those three letters, HIV, as Edwin has told you, we haven't seen a decline. We've actually seen an increase across the globe. And it is just fear-based, fear and stigma-based. So I've lost everything. So it doesn't matter economic, it doesn't matter your personal, it doesn't matter anything. So I sit here in the Pentagon, just not even a half a mile down from the studio, a lieutenant colonel in the Army, 26 years, and I literally now have just lost everything. I've lost my retirement. I've lost my ability to get a job because of the felony conviction that this rolls with it. Most of the crimes are at the felony level across the globe. Employment is almost barred from that. Some states, because of the way they word the crimes, people are subject to sex offender registration, even without sex or violence or non-consent. It's the way that the crimes have been labeled under the laws.
And that stays with you for life, right? If you're on the sex offender registry.
For life. And thank goodness New York State was smart enough. I didn't have to do that, but I would have to if I moved to any other state. I may have to. If I came back to DC, if I was lucky enough to get a job, DC may look at the military wording of that crime, HIV exposure, in the actual charge, and they may require me, even though there's no sex or violence or non-consent, any of those terms that everybody on the streets would kind of know. And then to label this as an aggravated assault. Most of them at the felony level or across the globe, aggravated assaults. Mine has just been reduced to assault and battery.
And that's after an appeal? Or
after the appellate process. But even those terms, could you imagine? You go to the movies and you hear assault and battery. What does that mean? It means, someone physically beat the heck out of somebody, there was some kind of violent contact. None of that exists in most of these charging, all surrounding HIV.
Edwin, there was a point that Ken raised that made me think of this graphic. It's been floating around online. Take a look here. Around the world, people living with HIV are being given lengthy prison sentences for, in some cases, just spitting or scratching another person, even though there is no risk of HIV transmission. Because you were talking about transmission, Ken, and this is from the Stigma Project. Edwin, can you talk to us about the spitting and the scratching? If there is no transmission, then why could someone go to prison for that?
Well, a lot of it is because some of the laws are written so broadly and without any understanding of risk or science, or the actual prosecution itself has been tarnished by HIV stigma. So there's a guy languishing in a prison in Texas. His name is Willie Campbell. He was a homeless man and he was arrested in 2008. And during his arrest, he was unhappy and spat on the policeman. If he hadn't been living with HIV, they probably would have just let that go, or perhaps it would have just been common assault. But because he was living with HIV, the jury found that his saliva was a deadly weapon, and he was sentenced to 35 years in prison. So this isn't even stuff we're talking about from the 80s and 90s. This is relatively recent stuff. Ken and I were at a meeting last month, the HIV is Not a Crime conference in Alabama, and we met a young man called Apollo who lives in Oklahoma, and he was accused of sneezing on someone. And because he was accused of sneezing on someone and having HIV, the police came, arrested him, put a spit hood on his head, and he's waiting on July 1st to hear whether actually these ridiculous charges will be dropped. So the stigma around HIV, unfortunately, and the fear around HIV has remained from the 1980s, and yet we've moved so far forward in understanding HIV risk, and that HIV is certainly nothing like a death sentence with access to good treatment.
And this is one of the problems that you that we have with these laws, is that they're completely overly broad in the way that they're drafted, and bear very little resemblance to reality in terms of how HIV is actually transmitted. For example, in Kenya, a law was put in place a couple of years ago, which required people living with HIV to disclose their status to any sexual contact, but there was no definition of what sexual contact is. So sexual contact could be anything from kissing to holding hands to stroking your leg, to none of which have any risk in terms of HIV transmission. Mm-hmm. But that's one of the problems with these laws, is that they're so overly broadly worded. In Zimbabwe, for example, there's also a law that was put in place some years ago, where you don't even have to transmit HIV or expose anyone to HIV. You just have to, if you have reason to believe that you might have HIV, which, let's face it, if you've had sex in the last number of years, or have had a blood transfusion, or many other things, right, there may be a risk that you have HIV. But that law is so broad that it even covers not even knowing your status, but if you think you might have HIV. I mean, it's just completely crazy.
So we're hearing from people who are actually actively trying to do something about this very directly. We have a video comment here from the United States. Check it out.
Hello, my name is Pat Steadman, and I'm a state senator in Denver, Colorado. This year I was the sponsor of a law that decriminalized HIV infection for sex workers in our state. We did this to promote testing and treatment and protect public health from transmission of HIV. There were objections from some in the law enforcement and prosecution communities, but when they understood the science and how we can prevent HIV infection, we were able to pass this law.
Anand, so you heard there Senator Steadman basically talk about how education was key to getting this legislation changed. In your view, I know it's different in many different countries, but whose responsibility is it to get that education? Is it activist groups, or is it the governments? Who should be leading this charge?
Well, I think the government should do it. Government has the overall responsibility because they have the resources, but they must use the community, because you have to get to the community to get messages across the different sectors of vulnerable communities. But in terms of what the senator said, I think it was very important for him to mention, and he did, that it's based on science, which is flawed, and that's what is required to be understood. All these old laws are based on very old notions of science, and they are based on what are known as communicable diseases. And HIV is not the traditional communicable disease. It is a disease which is not easily transmitted, unlike, say, TB. So you are not likely to transmit HIV unless you have unprotected sexual intercourse, or you actually transmit bodily fluids through injections, or it's from mother to child. Now, unfortunately, even from mother to child, it is criminalized in the US, in some states, Sweden and Nordic countries. These are actually
What if
countries
the
where
mother
this,
doesn't take her medicine, or if she knows and still gets pregnant, or how
if she
does that
knows
work?
and well, if she's HIV positive and she has a baby, there are different types of scenarios, and they're very unfortunate. These are all preventable. There's no need to criminalize. Criminalization, unfortunately, has become the mainstay of a lot of behavioral models, including drug use, for instance, and these have to change. And especially on transmission.
Well, and because you mentioned that, I want to show this map here on my computer where HIV criminalization laws exist, and all of our guests today have talked about this being a global problem. You can see in red here those places where the laws do exist. Michaela, Namibia down here is not one of those places, and of course this is from the HIV Justice Network. It's not one of those places, but I will tell you which countries are. These are the highest number of prosecutions from 2013, 2015, Russia, the United States, Belarus, Canada, France. What is it that you and campaigners are doing in Namibia that you're not on this list?
Well, I mean, I hope that, I hope that the fact that we've been quite vocal in Namibia over the years about the fact that criminalization of HIV is not useful in terms of response to the epidemic has rubbed off. I think, as Anand was mentioning, it's really important that you speak to as many people as possible in as many different walks of life as possible, ranging from communities through to decision makers, parliamentarians, politicians, about what the science is and what is an evidence-based response to HIV. We've been doing a lot of work over the last couple of years with the Southern African Development Community parliamentarians. And it's as soon as people understand the uselessness of these kind of laws, and not only the uselessness, but the negative impact they have on an effective response to HIV, you find that people start changing their minds. And we've had really good successes with the SADC parliamentarians who recently, in November last year, passed a resolution to acknowledge that the use of criminal law in the response to HIV was not useful at all.
But we have some pushback here from people in our community that I think is important to bring up. People like Nima, who says, as a person I worked in the field with illicit drug-related issues, it's very common to see people with HIV sleep with others and not telling them, and many transmissions happen and ruined lives because of that. And Peter over here, who says it's not being positive that's the crime, it's failing to disclose, and we don't want any more Charlie Sheen stories. That's, for those who don't know, a celebrity who was accused of essentially engaging in sexual behavior with other people without telling them. Ken, what would you say to people like that who are raising these concerns?
So I of course have a completely opposite view, and I would say criminalize an act, not the virus. When it comes to sexual relations, it takes two to tango, is an old saying, and it applies to everything. It's not that someone is being deceiving to the other partner. It could be in the heat of, possibly we're talking about some of the folks who work at drug users, that you could have someone on a high, you could have someone completely sober. Sexuality is a part of this stigmatization that has been pulled in the HIV community. We've been focused, the MSM, the gay community, the sex worker community, all surrounding sex, but then the three letters of HIV. Take a look at it as you having sex with another person. We have movements out there that there are phone apps now. If you're going to hook up, you have to disclose, here, tap this. Some states say they won't do it. There's a movement to possibly even have to videotape that if we're going to have sex, that I would have to ask you.
Will people really do that? You're in the heat of the moment.
Can you imagine? Yes, that's the question though, but that's where we're taking it to. Yeah, Michaela's going to. Could you imagine yourself in the heat of that moment? Could you imagine children, young teenagers, the kids who have been born with HIV, growing up with that in a normal life? They have their first intimate moment and they've got to stop and just, I got to tell you, I'm HIV positive. I'm undetectable. We haven't even talked about that here. I'm undetectable. I can't hurt you. But could you imagine having to do that? That's where the laws have taken us to. So my response, I go back to this, is...
Ken, I'm going to have to pause you there because we're out of time. We are out of time. But if you want to hear more from all of our guests, there's an AIDS conference coming up in July, the 18th through the 22nd. You can see it on my screen here. This conversation will continue online with #AJStream.